Всем привет, это проект
Hello
Альфа.
everybody, this is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolay Feldman and you are watching War Diary live with Alexey Arestovich. Good evening everybody. Alright, let's start with the Peace Summit since this is an epic event and we would like to hear your personal opinion. Do you think it is a success or a failure? Oh God, give me strength. I'll try to be gentle. Okay. It was spinned with so much emotions and importance. And the question is, if it was a real success, would you need to do that? No. Right. So then we can take a sheet of paper, draw a line in the middle, and write the plus on the left and the minus on the right. So on the plus, Ukraine is still loved. People still feel for Ukraine, and they will continue helping it. There were a lot of good words said about Ukraine. These are all the pluses. On the minus side, what are the real results of this summit? Well, 78 countries signed the final communique. Okay, so what's in that final document? There are 4 demands in it, right? Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is ours, right? What else? Return of children, correct? Return of access to Azov Sea and return of free shipping. Okay, so we have 4 items that are signed and recognized by 78 countries. There were 2 more that signed and then withdrew their signatures. I think it was Iraq and Jordan who got back home and then recalled their signatures. So what does it change? It does not change anything, Nikolai, at large, because this is not a document worth of its content. And it is difficult to use it for successful diplomatic achievements. We cannot also say that the whole summit is a failure because you gathered 78 countries, a third of acting number of United Nations. And we're going together about a half of it, 160 countries were invited. Half of them arrived, a little over the half, 90 arrived, and exactly half of what was invited did sign it from the total amount. So the verdict is simple. This is not a regular diplomatic event, of course, but spinning it with so much emotion and importance, that is not exactly matching the real results of that event. They are rather modest. The support of Ukraine is still unwavering. They said several words about Putin, who right the day before that threw another ultimatum. And what? And if we remember our hypothesis that we mentioned before, that the real topic of this summit is to bring to your side the countries of the world not only against Putin, but also against the plan that is being suggested by United States, China, or France, then the idea was understood. To strengthen the position of Ukraine, read Zelensky administration, in their logic. Their logic is contradicting not only to Putin's peace plan, but also the plan offered by China, United States, and France. Ceasefire, etc., etc. Why was it important? It was important also to re-legitimize President Zelensky on the world arena, and I would say this was the main goal of this summit, to demonstrate international support and to address the question of illegitimacy and basically remove it, solve it. Today, Peskov made this interesting statement, spokesperson for Putin. He said that Russia is ready to conduct negotiations, but the final document of these negotiations has to be absolutely legitimate. That implies that there should not be a single way to misread it. Putin is a legalist. He is a graduate from a legal university and he's fond of these documents. When he was reading his message from his paper, he was quoting Kosovo precedent, a bunch of others as well. He needs the final paper. This is his important document for him. So what Peskov is sending us, we can negotiate with Zelensky, fine, but who's going to be signing it? That is why in their focus, there's a very specific story. He considers Zelensky to be illegitimate from his point of view. And exact wording is, nothing is able to reanimate Zelensky's legitimacy. Zelensky, on the other hand, conducts the peace summit that confirms his legitimacy. He got a lot of good words, a lot of support. He saw Biden before that, and he is showing that his legitimacy on the world arena is not in doubt. And by the way, he's showing that he is doing active things, he is bringing good to Ukraine, which is actually true. And today we see another publication that 70% of Ukrainians consider Zelensky to be legit president till the end of this war. So we have that, and we have a third of acting United Nations members who reaffirmed Zelensky's legitimacy. And I think this was the main target, the main goal of this event. This was to show both inside and outside that I am an acting president of Ukraine, and any doubt in this regard are irrelevant. The final document about nuclear security, Zaporozhye power plant, and the rest, this position was formed a long time ago. It was commonplace 2 years ago at the initial negotiations. Most countries never doubted that. They have not put formal signatures, right, but they have talked about this on different platforms, including United Nations. So the final resolution is the side effect of the main idea of this summit. The main idea, in my view, is that I'm legitimate, I'm the proper authority in Ukraine, and I'm the president of Ukraine and the supreme commander-in-chief. And basically Zelensky was destroying the main trump card of Putin, that he is illegitimate. This is his answer to Moscow grand narrative about illegitimacy of Zelensky. This is the main reason, raison d'etre, for this summit. And in this regard, it did suffer a sounding success, and nobody doubted it. Half of those who were invited and 3/4 of those who were attending, they confirmed that with their signatures, and that's it. What else? But when media outlets start to create the biggest international event, huge diplomatic success, first step towards the peace agreement, this is not matching reality. This is indeed a big success, but not for Ukraine, rather for Zelensky administration. In regards whether it is a success for Ukraine, only to a degree that they associate, if our listeners associate Zelensky administration with Ukraine. If you do, then it is a success for you. If you do not, understand you may have your own opinion, then it is not so much. So this is a very moderate success for Ukraine and significant success for Zelensky administration. That would be the proper evaluation, I think. All right, with your explanation, I can read now the statement by Zhovko, a representative of the Office of the President, about the fact that the summit was bearing an inaugurational character. I was trying to understand why are they talking about it. Now, in your logic, it actually makes it very clear. Then there is definitely logic in the statement. This is an achievement for them, absolutely. Right. And more than that, there is also another tail sticking out of it, that there'll be a next summit, and Russia will be invited to the next summit. This is an important statement. So this is the first step towards peace, then there'll be a second, and Zelensky himself said that it will be not years, but months. Behind the screens, they're saying that probably a few months. They may gather as soon as the end of summer, and I was communicating with my American friends here. That's the current message. From the point of view of peace process, it looks a little different, though, than it is presented. From the words of my friends, they've been discussing Putin's ultimatum behind the closed doors and how realistic it is, and the whole proposal by Putin, whether it's a useful suggestion to end the war. Nobody doubts the victory and the victory on Ukrainian conditions. Right, it's all good words, but realistically, they're looking just to finish shooting. That's what the partners are looking for. Putin's suggestion was reviewed. What was liked is that he is ready to cease fire. What was not liked, that he is presenting impossible conditions. Attendees were really surprised that he went for such a step, and nobody can explain why did he need to do it. Because when he declares Ukraine to be nuclear-free, bloc-free, and friendly, with that statement and everything that he'd done before, he made everything for that not to happen. That statement itself includes give us 5 districts demand. And after that, everybody in Ukraine wants to be definitely nuclear, join some bloc, and stay unfriendly to Russia. And after that, he talks about illegitimacy of Zelensky, and he re-legitimized, depends upon the black swans, at least for another year and a half. Because Zelensky today can tell anybody that, what, you're for peace negotiations with Russia? He's mad. His demands are unfulfillable. So Zelensky monopolized now the discussion about that as a result of Putin's statement, and he can also criticize everybody as a Russian spy who is trying to push peace agreements. And Putin created this service for Zelensky by his ultimatum. If Putin suggested a real peace plan, basically to fix the current border along the front line, perhaps not on paper, but just freeze the conflict, that would be a lot bigger, that would garnish a lot bigger support around the world. And I think this was the major mistake of Putin and his stance right now. Comparable with disagreement to fulfill Istanbul agreements, that's the first mistake, and now it's the second mistake that he's doing now. And this ultimatum of his completely contradicts all of his interests that are calculable, that are visible, all the informal interests that he says to all of the formal interests that he declares. So he fortified Zelensky instead of removing him. The demand about Ukraine being non-military, non-nuclear, he now directing Ukraine to go for a different target, exactly opposite. So I would say both opponents are worthy each other on this regard. If Putin at some point will agree to freeze the conflict on the front line, there'll be a different discussion. But for now, some other powers prevailed in his surroundings. There are also scary stories that somewhere behind the screens, countries are trading the conditions and negotiating, and that Putin just suggested the upper plank for the entry into these negotiations, but he is eager to do something else and to be happy with less. But we'll see what happens. But for now, according to his official statement, he did not leave any chance for Ukraine to go into negotiations, because nobody in the current world, under any circumstances, will sign that aggressor in the 21st century can change the borders of the country and acquire new territories. Never. With that, people can agree de facto, right, freeze by the front line, but not the euro. And he demands a paper. So he did everything to hear from prime ministers of Holland, Italy, for example, that, well, we cannot follow this suggestion. The suggestion is mad, as Scholz said, and we'll have to bind him with our will. Don't know what forces prevailed in his inner circle, or whether it was birthed in his own mind. The historians will have to look for an answer for that. But the most fantastic clipping of one's own wings, it's difficult to find. I wonder if there is some Russian spy or Ukrainian spy working in Putin's surroundings, or maybe an American. All right, we did talk in previous streams that Putin is a hostage of his own greed. And in the situation when he started to declare a framework, when there are options when we can save face and leave that conflict, which were rather reasonable at some moment, but then he makes a statement that completely contradicts. Perhaps it's a good starting trading point, but it doesn't look like an honorable version for agreement. Right, even for trading, that's a bad start, Nikolai, because that suggestion is basically a spit in the face of Ukraine. For 2 years, he is killing our citizens, dropping bombs on our citizens, and then he says that, okay, I'll sign a peace accord with you if you give me 5 districts, if you give me what I want. That's not how it works. Right, Alexey, not even agree, but just give me districts and then maybe I will sit down. Exactly. That means that nobody will ever accept these conditions And even those 33% of citizens of Ukraine who do want some form of peace agreement will never be able to neither accept these conditions nor even discuss them seriously. This is a colossal mistake, I think, and I personally don't know which diversion group was whispering in his right ear when he was writing this text. And that's from the point of view of his goal. From our point of view, everything remains the same. Of course, it will finish with negotiations, with freezing of the conflict sooner or later. The question is on what conditions. For us, his terms are completely unacceptable, so we will be fighting for our terms. We'll see whether they will bind us with this proposition or give us even worse, as they're threatening. I'm not sure that's going to happen. Who is going to get tired first? Also a big question, because on one hand, they don't have enough forces on the front. On the other hand, we are fighting very ineffectively. Let's acknowledge that in the open. And creation of European Commission to monitor the proper distribution of Western means and to investigate the cases of theft of Western funds coming to Ukraine. By the way, here I'm highlighting Western funds, not just our Ukrainian money. So, yeah, we are ineffective, but we'll still continue fighting. We don't have any other options. All right, we need to analyze what I think is happening on the other side. Nikolai, let's also announce a fundraiser. My stats show that if we announce the fundraiser at the end of the stream, we gather less. Let's talk about it now. Right, we do support Armed Forces of Ukraine, and we call upon our viewers. Okay, today we're gathering funds for 28th Brigade that are fighting on a hot part of the front. They are asking for some aid to buy Mavic drone. They need those. That's what helps them to survive. And both either attack or defend, Mavic is vital. The link to that fundraiser is under this video on both channels, Alpha Media, Alexey's channel, and a link in the privateer station will be to the original video on Alexey's channel. You can find that fundraiser there. I also wanted to analyze what's happening on the other side. What pushed Putin to such so-called inadequate norms or upper framework that is considered to be so inadequate by everybody. We have reparations, the statement of Big Seven that Russia has to pay reparations to Ukraine in the amount of 460 billion euros or dollars, I don't remember, dollars. That statement was made after his ultimatum, actually. Perhaps he knew that it's going to happen and he came up with his suggestion, but plus an attack on Moscow Stock Exchange, forbidding it to trade dollars and euro, and Britain joined later, forbidding them to trade in pounds. So this is a serious attack, a serious emotional splash that it caused in Russian society. And I think if you are Putin in this case, you had several options what message to send. He probably picked the most extreme one or the one before that. And there are some important words that he said. The main thread that he is leading through that message is that Russia is pissed. Russia needs to do that because of the position of the United States. United States systemically is destroying the world order in its favor and attacking Russia systemically. And poor Russia has nothing to do but to conduct this military operation, and as Putin presents. So what's behind it? Of course, there were some negotiations behind the screens before that statement was made. Perhaps several rounds of those, and those who participated, Americans, stated something rather painful for Putin. And that's what could have caused this message. Probably a result of some behind-the-scenes failed agreement or inability to find one, and something that hurts, in his view, his perspectives. And of course, he wants to make sure the situation evolves in his favor. And apparently, he's not getting it. What we see here is that in response to pressure the West increases the amount of aid to Ukraine, financial and military, to preserve parity. So Putin could not overwhelm that, could not organize proper summer campaigns, so the whole world is basically enforcing him to sit down at the table and negotiate. and basically stating openly via different representatives that we will not let you win over Ukraine. And also, by the way, nobody will let Ukraine win over Russia. Weaken Russia, yes. Make a huge trap out of Ukraine for Russia, yes. But to win entirely, no. So perhaps they've pressed some serious buttons. And the plan that was not the most realistic, not the most probable, was voiced by him in this case. Well, look, Putin also mentioned about the sanctions, that he is hopeful that the sanctions will be removed as the result of these negotiations and peace process, where he caused a whole slew of publications. And I think you posted something that the West does not want Russia to strengthen. Because he did mention before that sanctions do not affect Russia. Well, apparently they do, right? Understand this is the message that he had to send, and probably that is for his inner audience, because sanctions are one of the most painful aspects of this war for society in Russia. And interesting that he is naming them at the end. It doesn't imply that it's the priority number one. It actually is his priority number one. Territory is priority number two. All right, so all that volume of time, all the duration from the beginning of Ukrainian counteroffensive that was eventually turned into defensive operation and down to today, there are some opinions saying that this all was one big Ukrainian defensive operation that caused significant harm to armed forces of Putin, having taken away at least 100,000 lives of Putin soldiers. Is it a fair assessment of what's happening? So wait, what are they saying? From basically 4th of June of 23, that we are in the strategic defensive operation? Well, yeah, on one hand, it definitely is a strategic defensive operation because the war is in our territory, and everything that will be happening here, even for the fight for the last yard of our territory, if we push them back to the borders, it will be still a defensive operation. Within this big defensive operation, you can do a lot of other things, like strategic counteroffensives and other things. But overall, if you're really strict, you can say that, yes, this is, the whole war for Ukraine is a big defense operation. You can also say that something is falling apart in Kremlin, and due to the level of temperature and activity that they used in commenting everything happening around the summit, one can deduce that something is hurting them rather seriously about it. And they said a very interesting statement, that too bad Istanbul agreements were not signed. In 22, we were ready to give you back Kherson and Zaporozhye districts if you only left us a ground-based corridor to Crimea. So then one can ask a question. What about all these stories that they're defending some oppressed Russian population here that lives, according to them, in that Zaporozhye district? So they occupied it and then gave it back to so-called Ukrainian fascists to create a land corridor to Crimea. So a lot of disconnects there that are rather painful for them when somebody brings to light. And as somebody in Russia wrote recently, thankfully the summit is over, so all of the Z channels in Russia pro-Putin will not be starting every message with a pinned paragraph up top that this summit is illegitimate and useless. So I would say both sides exchanged rather significant blows, but diplomatic victory with slight advantages on the side of Ukraine. On the front, however, Russia continues to push. They are not very successful, but they do affect the psyche of Ukrainians and our partners, and they do inspire some of the Russians by capturing 3 villages or something, or creating a real operative tactical crisis on the Ocheretina-Pokrov direction. But still, this is minuscule compared to their original intentions. Where does the taking of Ocheretina or Pokrov stand compared to the goals stated by Putin? To non-bloc status of Ukraine, to losing 5 districts to Russia. These are very disconnected statements. So political statements of Russia are very disconnected from their successes or losses on the battlefield, rather. And Everybody is aware of that. Our problem is that we are continuing to conduct unsupported politics on the level of vocabulary, on the level of slogans, on the level of illusions fed to our people. Something like global success, return to the borders of 91, that's said by the country that produces barely 20% of its own equipment, and that has huge issues with economy, with mobilization. Any industry, any economy aspect you take, we do have issues there. You know, back in the day, 1878 war of Russia with Turkey was called a war of one-handed with one-legged. And that's quite about us this time. One also would want to add here that this is the war of one bluffing party against the other bluffing party. Both sides pretend and inflate to such a degree that they're completely disconnected from their realistic probabilities and capabilities on the battlefront. Everybody wants to be a major geopolitical player. Russia wants to capture the whole Ukraine or get 5 districts. Ukraine wants to capture Russia and some territories there, and in their imagination cutting and running Russia after the war. In reality, they're fighting for the left wall of the farm. And honestly speaking, this fight of geopolitical ambitions, which are completely decoupled from reality, is a new word in politics. I cannot remember another war from world history where, understandably, each war includes bluff and strategic deceit, but the war built on the fight of egos and the pure bluff, this is probably the first one. Everybody would and should rather become much more modest in this war, because if you guys, the taking of several houses in a lower Bendover village, this is not a strategic war. This is not about out-of-bloc status, out of the collective system of security in Europe status. And where is that compared to that village that they just took? On one hand, yeah, if they would be indeed taking districts and cities, that would make sense. But on the backdrop of this minuscule successes, all these huge statements and asks from Russia, you know, I do attack our politicians quite a bit for conducting unsupported politics in Ukraine, but if you look at Russia, they're also doing pretty much the same. They are not supporting their megalomania with the real achievements. Well, Alexey, you did mention Istanbul agreements and the land corridor to Crimea. There was also a leak before the summit, and it seems like it's the whole other kind of document, which Russia and Ukraine supposedly should have signed back in Istanbul. Any other information you want to comment about the data leaked on that format of agreement that New York Times has published in regards to Istanbul negotiations? Well, the accents were shifted in the Ukrainian media when they were trying to interpret what was going on. They were trying to hit the stool from under the Putin's narrative that Istanbul agreements need to be signed. Nobody wants to take responsibility for not signing them. And I was trying to chase that opinion through their major Telegram channels and mass media. Their main statement was that the agreements were about decreasing Ukrainian military down to 100,000. This is not so. Trust somebody who was heading the military aspect of these negotiations. They indeed insisted on that. They actually started with a funny number of 40 and 50,000. We were laughing in their faces and saying, you're completely inadequate. And from our side, we suggested to keep our troops during the peace times, not during war times like now, 1.3 million. During peace times, we said we should have an army of 250,000, exactly the same number that we had before the war, excluding the order of the president that buffed that number by another 100,000 right before the new year. So when they asked to reduce that number, we showed them, hey, see, president added another 100,000, we will cancel that and we'll stay within 250,000 as before. And this is a big enough number that would enable us to defend ourselves and give us time to deploy more troops on the ground should another round of war occur. And unfortunately, our analysis, our analytics that we see in the media turned into just regurgitation. They're not really using logic. They're rather using this topic for their own push and their own popularity, but they're failing to notice something that I think is rather more sensational. They published in that leak, the message I think was from something of April, right? Yeah, I think it was 4th or 6th of April. Indeed, you want to verify, but by that time, Bucha has already happened. Society already knew that Bucha exists. The explosion of emotion and conflict already happened around Bucha, but negotiations still continued. Well, Alexey, I'm also reading a translation here. There is a subtitle here, an early project. They're saying that this is a project from the 17th of March, showing how different they were. The Times was looking at the English language version that Ukraine gave to the Western governments, and that was the project of agreement dated the 17th of March. Okay, that was before Bucha. Well, looking at the article and all these statements made by Washington Post and the like, that main sensation was that Bucha still did not interrupt the negotiations. That destroys both narratives, the Ukrainian narrative and Putin's narrative. His propaganda is saying that Bucha was used as the breaking stone, as a provocation that Ukraine used to leave those negotiations. And I want to say that in reality, negotiations continued down to May, to the first Rammstein. And that's what historians should pay attention to, in my opinion, because both grand narratives, they do not match reality. Ukrainian narrative that we left negotiations after Bucha, and Putin's narrative that Ukraine used and created that provocation in Bucha to leave those negotiations. As I remember, they were rather busy throughout May. They slowly dwindled in June, but May was very active. So after Bucha, we were still negotiating. But you see, the level of analytics and understanding in our society is now at a rather low mark. So they would rather show some scary numbers and show that there was no rational seed in this document. But I want to tell here once again that any future document will use Istanbul agreements, Istanbul material as a backbone, because there is nothing else. And it would not make sense to not use the documents that were thoroughly negotiated for 3 months by both parties. So in any case, Istanbul agreements will be taken as the core. And Putin also mentions that, and international opinion, international discussions also go around that same idea. That's why, of course, it would make sense to go deeper into the agreement and see what is applicable, but still it is definitely a backbone. Another interesting aspect, they called it the main point of contention, and I don't see anybody caught that. They said the main point of contention for Ukrainian delegation, since this document implied that security guarantees would be provided by all active United Nations Security Council members, including Russia and China. And Russia wanted the right to veto anything. And in case Ukraine is being attacked, the document implied that there would be consultations held within the first 24 hours. They did not imply the aid coming within 24 hours, but, initial communications and covering the skies and figuring out how to support. But still, Russians insisted on the right to veto that. They insisted that each of the country's guarantors could have applied the veto, implying that they could do that too. And that basically turned all the guarantees of protection into nothing, because they would technically could attack Ukraine again and then veto any aid to Ukraine. Or they could use Belarus as a proxy to attack Ukraine and then basically use that right to veto any additional aid coming from Ukraine, from anybody. They wanted to keep this article. They did not want to budge, and that we could not circumnavigate, and they were insisting on this article. Yet there was no serious analysis of it, and I have not seen any of our analytics looking at it. And several, therefore, rather changing circumstances that could change the whole perspective of this document were missed. That tells me that this is more used as a propaganda than a serious tool to discuss and analyze. And yeah, they picked up an element for 100,000 and saying that, oh, this document claimed that Ukraine will only have 100,000 troops at the end of the war. No, this was not so. This is not the major element of it. So the task, Alexey, for the next peace summit, whenever it happens, according to suggested framework of Zelensky, it will be months, not years, probably as early as end of summer or September. What task, what's the biggest task you think should be stated in front of the summit? Given that Saudi Arabia already mentioned that Ukraine perhaps should be ready for serious compromise, and our statements today are not really revealing any readiness to any compromise, at least by the officials of the country. Where is that middle that we can look at? You know, Nikolai, I think compromise is a very immature word for diplomacy. And I would remind once again that negotiations themselves is just one of the floors. We need the whole building. The whole building is the system of collective security in Europe, which, by the way, was mentioned by Putin as well. And if we are going as Europe to a collective security system to replace the destroyed Potsdam-Yalta system that was destroyed systemically by different things like Kosovo, Yugoslavia, the fall of USSR, etc., etc., etc. So a lot of agreements are not working de facto, including the 1975 agreement in Helsinki about the borders in Europe, and norms about the nukes and other things, and strategic attack weapons. So all the contractual system that was holding wars in Europe and preventing conflicts from turning into hot conflicts, it is destroyed. It is either on pause or the contracts are not fulfilled at all. And if we want to achieve a new serious agreement that will eventually be supported by a bunch of other agreements and contracts and obligations, I think we need to be looking at considering the real interests of the sides, not the principle of painful compromise. I don't like that. Everybody is talking about painful compromise now. And for some reason, they're talking about painful compromise for Ukraine, first of all. I understand they're trying to cool down our hot heads who are screaming the borders of 91. But I would remove the word compromise from this vocabulary, with all my respect to Saudi Arabia and the rest who are using it. I would instead look at the real interests of the sides. This is a more serious discussion. We can define those real interests and we can see how we can solve them jointly. Because all of them are rather practical and rather solvable tasks in any field of human activity. When you talk about compromise, it's the national pride of any country, be it Ukraine, Russia, any other country, Zambia, Tanzania, whatever. The national interest would be no compromises, right? And this is what creates the ground for all these emotional statements. We will never compromise. We will fight till the last soldier, not a yard of our land. And all that fluff that does not allow to solve the main task, then to create a new system of security in Europe that would be preventing new wars and that would have effective mechanisms to prevent them. And when people start running around with the word compromise and slapping your face with the word compromise, then the normal person, normal citizen gets upset and says, no compromises. Well, problem is, any war will end up in a negotiation anyway. Each side will add another 100,000 dead before it happens. And the thing is, with compromise, Russians want us to compromise, we want them to compromise. And for that vocabulary, we're apparently eager to, each side, to waste another 100,000 people. That's why I'm suggesting to remove the word compromise from this view and start using real interests. Ukraine has real interests, Russia has real interests. If we don't want to look at them, we can continue fighting, but the moment we start negotiating, we need to start looking at real interests. And compromise doesn't cover that. If you keep it there, it'll be running in circles forever. Put the word interests there and we'll start moving things much faster. This is my humble advice to the organizers of these summits. Not a real situation on the ground, that's the Russian vocabulary, and not compromise, but real interests. This is a different vocabulary that will lead us to something, I hope. Both sides. All right, let's clarify here. Because on one hand, somebody says that real interest of Russia is Crimea and land-based corridor to it. The rest seems to be maneuvers and fluff around that real interest. This real interest, it happened to be that it can be realized at the expense of lands that are belonging, legally recognized by the global society, to Ukraine. These lands were annexed militarily from the Ukrainian register. And how can one agree with such an interest of Russian Federation? Well, here we probably should look at the framework, Nikolai. The first thing that isn't within this framework for Russia is absence of global wars in Europe. I don't know, looking at their actions, it doesn't seem so. Well, it is so. Remember how they started this war, how Naryshkin was wiggling under Putin's look, and he was preferring to sneak away and to not say that we need to fight. Of course, there will be some group of idiot generals and some of the top-level corruption people who make their money on wars, but at large, each country definitely is not in favor of war. And all they need to do is really just keep at bay the interests of those oligarchs who produce military equipment and those who earn points at war. War is very inconvenient. War looks only as a convenient tool if your army has an advantage, like Americans had over Iraqi army, 2 or 3 generations. But when armies are about the same level, the war is never an easy walk. Even Americans, after having defeated Iraq, had to leave it, having lost a bunch of people there and left the country in a state of civil war, essentially, that birthed ISIS and returned Taliban to Afghanistan. So the war, in its concept of let's go solve this problem, is a very poor tool. It was always a poor tool, but in the 21st century, it's a useless instrument. If the war is a continuation of politics by other means, it is a very difficult and inconvenient instrument. So if we take that paradigm, then the rest of the demands of this agreement need to follow suit. And if their interest is in owning a piece of land in Zaporozhye district is higher than absence of wars in Europe, then what can we talk about with them? There's nothing to talk about with them. Why are they suggesting that peace then? Well, to declare that they're peaceful and they want peace. All right, but it doesn't give them anything. Sanctions are not being lifted. While they said they're peaceful and they threw the demand for 5 districts, they got slapped with reparations for $500 billion, and Moscow currency exchange is now essentially ineffective and closed. And it's not working what they're suggesting. All our channels, from president to individual, they're saying that this is not acceptable. And it's only Russian bots who still support that Putin statement and saying we will show them how we'll get there. In reality, the world has just wiped their collective butt with this Putin's ultimatum. Scholz, we did not expect any outstanding from him, but even he came out and said that this is a very non-serious proposition. So if we are interested in a collective system of security in Europe, we need to change the tone and we need to address real interests. I can name some of the Russian interests as I understand them. First is absence of wars and presence of that collective security system. Second is lifting of sanctions and restarting that usual economic relation mechanism, political, economic, cultural. Third is what? Access to Crimea. Preserving Crimea under the umbrella and establishing some land-based corridor to that land. And only after that, keeping the territories and districts that they have included into Russian constitution. Their real interests are dictated by what? By refusal to bear the blame of defeat in the eyes of their society. That's why they want probably to keep Crimea and Donbass behind them. So de facto, we're talking about the borders of the 23rd of February with some slight modifications. Now, and also an out-of-bloc status of Ukraine. They're really concerned about our joining of NATO. So what our interests are for Ukraine? The first one is that to never, 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 in capital letters, have another round of war with Russia, so that the use of force by Russia against Ukraine would have been removed from the stage and from the palette of options for several dozens of years, at least. So if the horizon is at least 20 years, right, Vladimir Putin might live a little longer. I don't think he'll live longer than 20, but okay, let's say 30. Let's say our window is 30 years. Then the key questions that we cannot come to agreement about, we can move them out by 30 years and address them later. This is one option. Second, security in the Black Sea, by the way, that's also mutually important. For us, it's import-export. For them, it's lack of NATO presence there and making sure that they can continue their trade. Because our drones can shut down their Novorossiysk port, which they use for exports of 50% of their oil products. So we both can declare that region to be a safe zone. And if we both have a contention of the military status of Crimea, we can demilitarize Crimea and make it internationally governed territory. We can leave it to be governed by United Nations and mutual work of both countries, or coalition of countries guarantors, for example. And those who became a country guarantor get economic preferences in Crimea. Crimea becomes a free economic zone, and it gets new development as a recreational, educational, and other industries, whatever comes there to flourish. Like Spitsbergen Island, right? It was a point of squabble between different countries, then they separated it into different zones, and different countries are using it. We do not have to divide Crimea into zones, we can just jointly manage it. And have the permanent members of Security Council of the United Nations, they get an access to Crimea. There are no Ukrainian troops, there are no Russian troops, there are only United Nations peacekeepers, and you can remove the status, the solution of this status out by 30 years and then reconvene. And nobody has to die under ATACMS missiles, nobody has to be holding that bridge till the last soldier. Then the guarantee of security is being spread throughout the whole Black Sea region. All sides would support it. Russia and Ukraine would support it. Nobody would be attacking their vessels with our drones. Nobody will be hitting Crimea with ATACMS. They don't need to worry about their railroad, about their bridge. And Crimean Bridge becomes the element of stability and perhaps maybe an element of the new Silk Road and being exploited internationally. And then you remove the solution out by 30 years and we reconvene then if the current generation of politicians in power cannot solve it. And of course, it can be reviewed at any moment if there is any goodwill. And that's it. Donetsk, Lugansk, okay. Do not bring Ukrainian troops, withdraw Russian troops, conduct international referendum, give people the right to vote. Yes, they've been brainwashed. Everything, of course, is considered, but it should be free for political propaganda of different parties, political process. People should be allowed to vote. Those who were living in the territory back in 2014, who migrated since then, if there is a real will to do that. And if these people express a desire to be a part of Russia, okay, then this is a will, and there is no reason to use our tanks to enforce it. We can stop at this and offer them the maximally open autonomy. We can also include those territories into the internationally managed territories, creating a new precedent how to solve these conflicts internationally. There is always a way if there is a goodwill. But since the rhetoric is generally flowing in the logic of hurt national feelings, there is no perspective to solve this conflict then. And in order to solve it, one needs to get rid of the word of vocabulary for compromise and needs to start addressing the real needs, the real security demands of both sides. If we are looking at them realistically, there is a chance to find peace agreement. If we're avoiding and dodging them and accusing each other, there is no way to negotiate. But this is the only solution that can be. That's why the central question to Putin, to us, to everybody, do we want to create a system of collective security and subdue other interests to that system? Or do we want a land corridor to Crimea and to boast that we have achieved the goals of our military operation? And if so, then okay, welcome ATACMS for Crimea and drones hitting Novorossiysk on the bridge. We already are doing that, and there'll be more. Well, right. The question here, Alexey, is the real interest is, one, if their interest is Crimea and land corridor and remove sanctions and take it as is, then that's a dead end for any negotiations. Right, Nikolai, if that hypothesis is correct, then F-16s, ATACMS, drones, and everything else will continue hitting that territory and their interests. And if not, then we can start sit down and negotiate. There is even the most extreme option here, just freeze everything, according to the current front line, and leave everything in the gray zone, without any peace agreement, just like between North and South Korea. Just ceasefire, and both sides get an opportunity to develop. And let's go back at that at 30 years and see who develops better. North Korea or South Korea? Well, sorry to interrupt you, Alexey, here, but this current situation didn't really bring them to full isolation. Well, if they want to freeze it, there'll be no sanctions removal. It'll be just a ceasefire. And the sanctions still remain in place. Sanctions get lifted only when there is a goodwill and a desire to atone for crimes committed and aggression that happened. Well, perhaps maybe there'll be some sanctions lifted for ceasefire initiative, but the main package will remain intact. This is not even discussed. This is not on the table. Sanctions can be lifted only when there is goodwill on both sides. And when we're being told that, well, Russia will turn the whole world in nuclear ash and will capture the whole Ukraine, and that Ukraine is a very ineffective state, which is partly true. We're not truly effective. But this is decoupled from reality. The West will not let Ukraine lose. With all our dumbness, ineffectiveness, and clown and circus elements, they will not let us lose. And that implies that Russia will continue suffering gigantic losses, and the sanctions will be added. Every time they'll be more stubborn, they'll be getting more sanctions, and there is no easy exit in this situation for Russia. None. In order to change that, they need to get somehow the amount of weaponry equal to about a third of Chinese army to change this balance. This is technically an unsolvable task. Putin will go to Korea before the summer offensive and will bring probably more artillery shells to Russia, but this will add a little more to what falls on our heads, but it doesn't solve this problem for him. And it will not. Russian Federation cannot reach militarily the goals that they declare. We also cannot, but we are bluffing because this is our state politics, and we're keeping the idea of our bigger Ukraine. But on their side, what's that? He is stating that he is a serious geopolitical figure, and he is accusing Ukraine of being a charade. Okay, then why does Russian politics look more and more like a charade? Well, Alexey, it appears that they do not have the balls to explain to their people in the country that their real goals were Crimea and land-based corridor, and that's why they wasted almost 500,000 Russians dead and wounded. Well, one of the other goals they have is Ukraine not joining NATO. Okay, but in the current level of financing and support that Ukraine is getting from all the NATO countries, bilateral agreements, even with the United States now, we have a 10-year contract with them. De facto, I think we are way better than if we would be joining NATO. We just would have never tested that. Not exactly so, Nikolai. This can be circumnavigated in a much easier fashion. You don't want us in NATO? Fine, we'll join EU. EU already has its army, and it'll be growing, and the financing of that army will be growing. They're getting ready to establish a position of Minister of Defense for EU. So you think they will not give any guarantees for their EU members, and the EU army will be standing and watching when one of the EU countries is going to be attacked? Maybe I did not express myself precisely. They should understand that getting into NATO or not getting into NATO doesn't really change anything for Ukraine. De facto, Ukraine remains a very difficult fortress. Well, Nikolai, they have a historic butthurt. And that butthurt is about them supposedly being deceived about the expansion of NATO. And it would be good for us to understand their position, because if we'll be just laughing at it, we probably will not reach agreement. We need to be very accurate about it. They really believe, and they're wasting hundreds of thousands of troops here in Ukraine, and that one of their goals is to make sure Ukraine never joins NATO. This is really one of their red lines. We can laugh at that, but they will be fighting for it as long as there is political will. So if it is a red line, why should we fight for it? Is NATO eager to accept us? No, they don't. Right, we won't get accepted in Washington there again, and all these fairy tales about NATO, they're just fairy tales. This is not a healthy position. It's not a grown-up position. If the framework of collective security system in Europe is the goal, then okay, we don't need to join NATO or remove that for the next 20 years, because nobody will accept us for the next 20 years. But we can join EU. And we can change NATO for European Union membership. And we want to join EU, we just need a bit of a respite because we cannot join them in our current state, and we need to do a lot of reforms and do some rebuilding. And from all the requirements of EU, out of those 30 folios, we haven't even opened the first one because they have a lot of norms there, from the size of bus stations to space communications. But still, EU gives similar guarantees, security guarantees, as NATO. Nobody there will stand aside and watch and do nothing if one of the EU members is attacked. Then it is also a military bloc. Just hear me. Don't want us to be a part of NATO? Fine. Let's swap one for the other. Let's establish a delay on the NATO question and for now join EU. That's another option. Everything can be resolved with the presence of goodwill and remembering that we're not talking about compromise, but we're talking about interests, and we do have some common interests. We have a basic argument for all sides. There is initial structure, initial interest for all the sides, new collective system of security. When Russians add the word just, okay, not against that, considering real interests is what makes it just. So in this case, we can freeze the war and we can discuss it for 30 years if we want to, until we find the right formula. But my question is very simple. What for does that war continue on both sides? It continues because each of the sides still hopes to push their own understanding of justice. For them, it is 5 occupied districts. For us, it is GTFO from Ukraine. Nothing will work if we stay there. We need to be looking for formulas that would actually reflect the current state of things and interests, and defending these interests will become the justice, not measured in square yards, not measured in people, not measured in the tons of vessels in ports or jets on the airfields. The real reflection of justice would be to consider real interests. And then each of the sides will be able to go back to their people and say, we fought for not for nothing. We defended our interests and we created a system that would allow us to develop peacefully and to not let your kids and grandkids die. And only this approach would allow them to slowly rebuild economic and political and cultural connections again, because this is inevitable. With all the lengthy and bloody bill on both sides, we're still bordering nations in 5 years, in 10 years, but they will start rebuilding. Those politicians who look forward will need to consider that. There will never be previous love, but economy will still have some relation. That same gas transit still occurs even during the war. Civil flights going through the territories, and a lot of different things that will happen. And you can use that as a training ground. You can use it as a precedent. How should I formulate it correctly? Of normal politics over the wounds and ambitions. When Crimea becomes, for example, an international zone, and Donbass as well, where 5 permanent members of United Nations plus Ukraine as the owner of the territory get demilitarized zone for prospective growth. Of course, we cannot be left alone with Russians in Crimea because we'll be squabbling again. But if we have Chinese, Brits, and I would also bring the United States and Germans, and run the economy and run everything jointly, and then that's how you can try to rebuild everything. Some system of relations in the future, because it is inevitable, however painful it is right now. That's how wise people do. And if wise people do not want collective system of security in Europe, but want to just pressure their understanding of justice on the level of borders and other aspects, then the war will continue till one side is utterly defeated and destroyed. Whichever side is defeated, I will not specifically on purpose outline whether Russia will prevail or whether Russia will lose, but I would say regardless which of the countries loses, it will cost the other country colossal price, economic, political, headcount, all of that together that would limit and would steal the opportunity to develop and would steal the lives of 3 to 4 generations after. So one has to be a serious idiot to continue pushing that. That's where one can pose a question about real interests of politicians. Do you really want good for your people? Do you want them to grow, or do you want them to dwindle and get extinct? Do you want to clean landmines and die in the trenches, or do you want them to fly to Mars and create new civilizational advancement? This war is stealing the future from current and the next 3 to 4 generations. These 2.5 years have already stolen a lot. 1 day of war costs 3 days of minesweeping after. By all the organizations and every minesweeping capabilities of this planet, if we just pause the war now, it'll take them 40 to 60 years to clean up the territory, if they freeze any other action they have. Without that, probably 200 years. Of course, some of the landmines will fall apart by that time, but it's a serious problem. 1/3 of our fields are covered in landmines. Or do Russians like when our drones attack their oil refineries? And we'll be hitting more. And further, do they like 500,000 losses? They'll suffer more. Do they like destroyed Belgorod or burning oil refineries near St. Petersburg? What are we talking about? What do you want? Do you like sanctions that are stealing your future and your technologies? You like being a dependent, a vassal state of China? Do you like switching to yuan now? You tie Russian future to China? Is that the goal of this war? Is that your interest? Now from being a third or whatever, one of the superpowers, you're becoming a subsidiary of China. Is that the interest of Russia for future generations? These are the questions worth of asking. Because Russians, even those who were evaluating Istanbul agreements out in the public, they also think rather simply, very short thoughts. Not a single yard of Russian territory is lost. All the suffering is for Ukraine, and we can just tighten the belts and continue attacking. Well, look at your status. Look at what's happening with you because of sanctions, because of dependency on China, dependency on the South, the loss of oil market in Europe, loss of scientific potential. Look carefully at your different generations, which ones do support this operation, this war, and the ones that do not. You're setting up a huge mine, a huge time bomb in your society on this topic. A very difficult conflict of generations, a conflict of models of development of Russia for the future. So this war will cost you a lot. What did Russia turn into? That in order to prevent this conflict from exploding, they have to repress their people harder and harder. When a person is repeatedly being hit with a stick over its head, they put the helmet on, or a bucket, and then from all the hitting and the noise, they lose strategic perspective and they start supporting false decisions. Yes, it is a remote poison. Ukraine right now is suffering more materially, and visibly it's suffering more, but Russia is losing its future in this war. Do Russians consider this interest when they calculate things? This is the question I'm asking them. I know you guys are watching me. Think about this. If you really, not on words, but on deeds and reality, you do want collective system of security in Europe that would consider your real interests, then let's stop this war, outline these interests, the real ones, Ukraine, Europe, and the whole world. If so, be it, we'll find a way to accommodate your interests with Belarus as well, if you're allies. Or the interests of Shanghai Organization or Mutual Defense, CSTO org. If we need to discuss it for 3 years, well, we'll do it for 3 years. If we need to talk for 5 years, we can talk for 5 years. But there will not be a war raging in the meantime that is destroying future of both. War is a horrible tool, but you can still use it if you really can subdue your enemy and enforce your will over them. But 2.5 years later, I think you already realized that there'll never be a time when you can subdue Ukraine. So it means what? That we're continuing the war to waste another 100,000 on each side, destroyed families, killed people, destroyed economy, stolen future from both sides. To achieve what? To sit down eventually at the table of negotiations. So what are we paying for? For stubbornness and inadequacy in accepting the fact that war cannot be the means to solve all. If one could solve the problem with war, I would be for it. I would cross myself and say, it's important that we finish it. But war is a very horrible tool, and right now it leads to nothing. All these problems that we're facing can be solved differently, and ultimately will be solved differently, because this war is incapable to solve it. At the big round table, and it can grow from peace formula, from anything else, but the main goal would be to resolve the issue of conflicts in Europe, and preferably on the longer run in the whole world. While if you want to measure your ambitions, yes, the war will continue. If you're responsible adults and you don't want to steal future from your children, then we should probably negotiate. We haven't really graduated from the Second World War. All the scars have not healed. You know how my teacher said, a yard-deep trench takes 100 years to grow over. These trenches have not really grown over from the Second World War, and we're already fighting another one. What's the purpose? Once again, we need to bring real interests in the corner and sit down at the table and find real ways to resolve this conflict. That's what both sides need to be doing. Whether you pick a peace formula for that or pick a different formula for that. If you need a land corridor to Crimea, this is also solvable. I suggested how to do it earlier. One of the ways would be to implement international management in Crimea. Then, of course, it will be open and available for everybody to reach. If we're making it a recreation economic zone, a free economic zone, a zone of prospective development under international management. This is your protection of Crimean citizens, their rights, their future, the rights to real estate and ownership there, and perspectives for safety in the Black Sea region. Not a bad solution, right? If you really care about people there. A great speech, Alexey. I think it had to be pronounced today in light of Putin making a big strategic mistake, making or bringing that ultimatum up to the world. So that framework is clear. End of part 1.